Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Deku failed his entrance exam. If you guys enjoy this movie, comment down below and let me know. Before I start, please do support for more awesome content. And leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. So let's start the video. From 𝗵𝗃 to 𝗂𝗄, 𝗔𝗂𝗵𝗲 was many things: a nerd, a little bit of a wuss, a strategist, and most importantly a hero otaku. Oh, and also, he was, somehow, the successor of All Might, receiving the quirk just a couple of hours ago from his mentor, barely giving him enough time to head to UAS entrance exams. And now he was taking the illustrious practical exam. The exam that only allowed 1 in every 300 people pass to get into UA, the one known for crushing a child's dream, and the one that was not known for having them fight robots the size of buildings. That was Izuku's current predicament. He had just jumped about 5 stories using his quirk. Then he pushed the newfound power into his arm, blowing off his sleeve, and then he smashed the giant monstrosity known as the Zero-Pointer with so much power that now it was nothing but scrap metal. However, there was one thing that 𝗧𝗵𝗲 did not account for when he decided to take on this Goliath to save a girl trapped in rubble. How am I going to land? And now his screams were ringing through the testing area, as anyone and everyone around turned to see the boy fall out of the sky. Ochako Uraraka, the girl he had tried to save by destroying the Zero-Pointer, willed herself to move, even though she felt like she was going to throw up as she used her quirk on the pile of rubble atop her. She climbed onto it and removed her own gravity, floating as fast as she could towards the falling boy. Please make it in time," she yelled to herself as she reached with her arm. Just barely, she could make it. She pulled her arm back and slammed it forward, only to feel empty air, and then a splat, and then screams of other contestants. She looked down and threw up. Not because of her quirk, but because of the sight that greeted her. Red, nothing but the color red, covered a sizable part of the street. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 had without a doubt died. No chance, he was dead, absolute dead. Dead worse than All Might would be in a couple years because of his terrible respiratory system. Dead worse than 𝐭𝐴 would be when she found out her one and only child had died taking UAS entrance exam. His body laid motionless on asphalt as his legs and right arm stuck out at odd angles, the purple skin on display for all to see. It was so obvious that he was without a doubt dead. So that begged the question, how am I not dead? And how am I not in pain? He asked himself as he gasped for air and felt the familiar feeling of grass underneath him, acting as a pillow for his entire body as he laid down, as well as tickling his skin at his wrists and neck. He shot up quickly into a sitting position and looked around hastily, seeing nothing but green for a while and what looked like a stone wall far off in the distance. There was no doubt about it, he was in a grassy field. But how? He moved his hand, the tickling of the grass leaving his arms as he inspected them. His right one, the one he slammed into the Zero-Pointer, the one that exploded into pain and misery, was fine and now covered in a glove. Both of them were actually. His legs were perfectly healed too. They weren't bent in any deformed shapes, they weren't screaming in pain, they weren't purple, none of the sort. And he was now wearing his red shoes. He tested them by standing up, and found he was perfectly fine, no pain at all. He looked over his body, noticing a change in clothes as well. He had his amazing red shoes obviously, but his tracksuit was gone, replaced by navy pants and a white dress shirt. Over the shirt was a green vest. The vest was tight, however. Then he felt a weight on his back and on either side of his hips. He looked at all 3 places. On his right hip there were 2 pouches, ones that seemed like they could be used to store small items. On his back was a backpack, probably for bigger items. And on his left hip was a canteen, a sword. Ben Cranial was many things. He was a go-getter, an achiever, a striver, a dork, a moron, and most importantly a terrible adventurer. He had just gotten back from the dungeon, covered in the blood of a minotaur. As he entered an old beat-up church, huffed and entered the room he shared with his goddess. However, she was nowhere to be seen. Bell surmised that she was probably working. He felt bad that 𝗧𝗃 had to keep up odd jobs around 𝗂𝗄 to make sure they had enough to make ends meet. He silently swore to himself that he'd get better, to make his goddess' life easier. He entered their shared bathroom and took a bath, removing all of the dirt and blood that covered him before going to wash his clothes, knowing that if he put it off then 𝗧𝗃 would clean it when she got home, and he didn't want to make any more trouble for her. Eventually, the job was done and he threw his pants and shirt back on. However, he left his jacket off as well as the breastplate that adorned it. He knew that food wasn't going to come for a while. As 𝗧𝗃 was the cook between the two of them, he couldn't cook to save his life, and he was fine with that as he wasn't that hungry. He inclined his head as he sat on the couch they had, thinking about the girl that saved him. Ina had told him about her, 𝐼𝐧𝐿, the sword princess. She was so amazing. She took down the minotaur like it was nothing, while he had done nothing but run away. She was level 5. She was so strong and beautiful too. She was everything that he wanted to be. He sighed as he sunk into the couch. He heard scrambling from beyond the door and 𝗧𝗃 popped into the room. 𝗏𝗏, and landed on his stomach, knocking the air out of him. "Goddess." Ida smiled as she got off. Sorry, but I have a surprise for you," she said as she hid something behind her back. Bell was definitely intrigued. He tilted his head slightly. "What is it?" "A legendary sword that would give him the power to rival level 5 adventurers. A shield that could block a strike from any enemy. A dagger that gave him the speed to match that of Hermes. A cloak that gave him invisibility." The possibilities were endless. Fried potatoes. And this was just as good. After the 2-8 Bell got his status updated, he heard a noise, like a gasp or something of the sort, as Hester read over his status. "Is something the matter, goddess?" Bell asked as he looked up at her over his shoulder. Hester shook her head. "Nope, you've just been making a lot of progress lately, that's all," she said with a smile as she lied through her teeth. Bell had gotten a new skill, his first skill, Lyris Freeze, and she didn't like it. But it read that it would allow him to grow faster as long as his feeling for a certain someone remained true. Bell's dream was to become an amazing adventurer, and if he could grow faster, then that was great. "Now, let's go to bed. I'm tired." Bell smiled a bit. Going down in the dungeon had been tiring for him, and it was just about to be nightfall too. "All right, goddess." Izuku approached the wall that he had seen earlier when he had just woken up. He was still confused about everything, really, but he needed to find out about where he was and why he wasn't dead. To his surprise, there had been a very long line to get into the walled-off city, but eventually he had reached the front. After conversing with the gate attendant, he was allowed to enter the city, which he learned was called Arario. He said in awe as he looked around. The city was huge, and while Musutafa was big too, this city just felt bigger, in scale and in presence. That may have had to do with the giant tower that dwelt at the heart of it. He found himself being carried over there by his feet. He wanted to see what it was about so badly, and that made him run through the streets, laughing and smiling as his wonder and curiosity overrode his sense of fear at being in an unfamiliar place. He saw other people, all of them wearing very different clothes from what he was used to. Many of them were wearing what looked like armor, and they carried weapons, swords, shields, staff, warhammers, all of the such. Then again, he did have a sword of his own, so he wasn't sticking out, but didn't know why he had all of this stuff. But it seemed to be the norm here. Running through the streets, he arrived at the giant tower and smiled in wonder. It was ginormous, the top of the tower reaching for the heavens. It was bigger than anything he'd ever seen. For some reason, it evoked more awe from him than Yue ever did. It was just breathtaking. That's all he had to say, really. Well, he thought it, but still. He saw people walk into the tower and either go up or down a giant spiral staircase. He wanted to follow them, but he had no idea what was down there. Maybe he could ask around. After seeing if he could get some food, he walked down one of the streets that met at the tower and looked for a restaurant or something that he could maybe get some food from. "Wait, do I have any money?" he asked himself as he checked his hip pouch and his bag. He did in fact find a small pouch with coins held in it. He had no idea how much they were worth or how he got them, but he thanked whatever god or goddess that was looking down on him for this blessing before continuing his search for a restaurant. Eventually, he found what he thought was a pub and gulped. Would he be allowed in? He wasn't of age yet, but he was really hungry, so he'd give it a shot anyway. He stepped up to the door and pushed it open. There were a lot of people. That actually makes sense. It's pretty late in the day. But he saw a couple of younger-looking people. They looked like children, and assumed it'd be fine of him to stay. He walked up to seats that reminded him of a bar or a diner, a table that stretched a long way, where workers would be behind to take orders. He didn't want to sit anywhere else as everyone seemed to be in groups, and he was just all by himself, so he sat down. A girl with black hair came up to him, holding a tray that was most likely used to carry food close to her chest. She was wearing a green dress, a shade lighter than his vest, and a white apron on top and a white headband. "Naya, is there anything I can do to help you, sir?" she purred with a smile. Izuku stared at her eyes. They were green just like his own, and briefly wondered what that first part of her sentence was about. Yes, I was wondering." He paused as he saw something strange atop her head. Cat ears. Now with the advent of quirks, many things were possible, but it was very unlikely to get cat ears. So seeing them was strange, but now the Naya did make sense. The girl creased her brows in worry as her eyes became a little sad. "Do you have a problem with my ears?" she asked with puppy dog eyes despite being a cat girl. Izuku quickly waved his hands in protest. "And no, not at all. I've just never seen someone with cat ears before," he said, staring at her with wonder. The girl suddenly grinned. "Naya, so I'm your first then?" She leaned on the table in front of them, smiling at him. Izuku nodded, the innuendo going over his head. He smiled just a bit. The girl pouted in response. She stopped leaning on the table and smiled at him, her eyes drifting up and down across his body. "So, what do you want to eat?" She licked her lips. Izuku looked away as he blushed in embarrassment before taking a deep breath and looking back at her. Miss Rollo, Chloe Rollo." She smiled. Izuku nodded. "Miss Rollo. I am new in town," he said. It wasn't a complete lie. Well, actually, it wasn't a lie at all. He was in fact new in town as he had never been here before, wherever here was. So, I don't really know everything that goes on around here. I have some money, but I don't know if it's enough to pay for a meal. He rubbed the back of his head in embarrassment. The girl tilted her head, a smile on her face. "Naya, so you want me to teach you how money works?" she asked, and 𝗧𝗂𝐴 nodded. She huffed and put her hands on her hips. "Fine, I guess that's something I can do. But in exchange you'll have to do something for me too, Naya." 𝗧𝗂𝐴 nodded. "That sounds fair." Chloe smiled. "All right. And if you want we could even give you the inn room since you probably can't afford one." Oh, this was going amazingly. 𝗧𝗂𝐴's sweat dropped. "Yeah, I don't have anywhere to stay," he conceded. He didn't even know how much an inn would cost, so it was safe to say he'd be taking this offer. So, he tilted his head a bit. "What do you need me to do?" Chloe simply smiled widely. And that's how 𝗧𝗂𝐴 found himself doing dishes, oh so many dishes. He quickly found out that the pub, the hostess of fertility, was quite a common place for adventurers and even gods and goddesses to hang out, whatever that meant. He assumed all the people wearing armor that were equipped were what she called adventurers, but he had no idea about this god and goddess mumbo jumbo. Still, he had a job to do and it was best not to get distracted. He had gotten to eat. Chloe said he barely had enough to pay for the cheapest meal on the menu, so he bought it and ate to his heart's content. It was absolutely delicious too. It rivaled even his mom's katsudo. His scrubbing slowed as a realization sat in. Would he be able to see his mother again? He had no idea where he was. He was in an unfamiliar location, no clue as to how far away it was from Japan. And on top of that, besides Chloe who he had met earlier and a couple of others that seemed to look like her, no one seemed to have a quirk. "You okay?" Chloe's new boy toy, Naya, another cat girl. This one was a brunette, grinned at him. He blushed a bit. "I'm doing all right." He wiped away a stray tear with his arm as his hands were still busy. The girl seemed to be intrigued. "Why the long face?" she asked as she walked around him. She enjoyed pestering people. It was one of her favorite pastimes. Though, Ryu would always manage to escape her grasp somehow. 𝗧𝗂𝐴 turned to her and smiled, although bittersweetly. "I was just doing some thinking is all." The other waitresses all leaned into the kitchen area. They all loved gossip and the new boy was very interesting, not even knowing about the currency of Aurario at all. And meeting the first 𝗔𝗏 in his life in the city too, he was weird. And so they all wanted to know about him, what he was about. Though Chloe did tell them to back off. "Naya." The girl bounced on one of her boots. "What is it?" 𝗧𝗂𝐴 felt a dry chuckle escape his lips. He wanted to say it was nothing, but he found that line of thinking quickly shut. "My mother," he said, halting himself as he put a washed dish off to the side. The girl was at his side with raised brows, wanting him to continue. I'm from a faraway land, and I'll probably never get to see her again." He didn't know where he was. He didn't know how far Japan was. He knew nothing. He was stranded. We weren't on the best of terms. She never really supported me in my dreams. She never said he could be a hero, only apologizing for his quirkless like it was somehow her fault. They lived together for 15 years and she never encouraged him to do so. It hurt, but in the end, she had been right, as he had failed. I just wish that I had a chance to thank her for everything she did. He continued washing dishes. Chloe found the boy oh so interesting, despite being 21. And the boy noticeably at least a couple years younger. She found that he ticked off all the right boxes in her head. "Naya, well, I'm sure she wouldn't mind seeing you again," the girl said with a smile. "I'm Anya, by the way. 𝗧𝗂𝐴 Midoriya." He introduced himself. She giggled a bit. That's a weird name. That made 𝗧𝗂𝐴 tilt his head in confusion. Japanese was weird here. Now he really didn't know where he was. But what language were they speaking then? And how did he understand it perfectly? Question. All questions and no answers anyways. "I'm guessing you came to explore the dungeon, Naya?" 𝗧𝗂𝐴 blinked. "Dungeon?" It was Anya's turn to blink. "You don't know what the dungeon is?" "NYAB, but what's with the sword then?" she asked, pointing at his blade that was off to the side with his bag, pouches, and vest. The other workers all held surprised faces. The boy didn't even know what the dungeon was. "I am afraid I don't," he said, rubbing his back before quickly pulling his hand away. He sighed. "I got bubbles on my hair, didn't I?" "Yup." "Okay." He got back to work. The dirty dishes just kept coming in without stopping. Anya made an effort to try and clean his hair, which he was grateful for, and eventually she began pestering him again. But he did have questions of his own. "What's the dungeon about?" Anya smiled at him. "Anything you want it to be. You fight monsters for any reason you have, to be an adventurer, to be a champion, to be a hero," he asked, cutting her off. She turned to him and snorted, "A hero. Now, that's not one you hear often." Naya, Chloe, and Sir turned to each other and each tilted their head. They had heard of very few ever wanting to be heroes before. Those that came to Aurario always wanted to be champions, first-class adventurers, and get into famous familias. They seeked fame and fortune. A hero was a rare thing. That was his reason. This boy was definitely interesting. but Sir already had her eyes on someone else. "So Mr. Hero, what's being a hero even about to you?" Anya asked. She was curious about what his definition of a hero was. Izuku smiled for the first time in a bit, a little bit of light invading his eyes. "A hero is someone who protects other people from monsters, villains. They save people who are in trouble. They meddle in things even when they don't have to." He sighed with content. "They're just heroes. I don't know how else to explain it." "Well, Anya, your break's over. Get out here." They both heard the loud voice of Mia Grand, or the owner of the pub. Her voice shook Izuku a lot and clearly did worse to Anya as she went ramrod straight before pouting. Anya turned to Izuku and smiled. "See ya, Naya, yeah. Bye." She left the little kitchen area. Darn Mia ruining her fun. Though she did see something that intrigued her. All of her fellow waitresses were waiting right outside the kitchen. She smiled at her fellow waitress as she saw them, obviously eavesdropping on her conversation with their new favorite subject. She glanced at Chloe. "He's fun, don't scare him away, Naya." She saw her fellow cat nosebleed a bit before Chloe quickly wiped it away. She simply giggled. Chloe turned back to the kitchen, watching as Izuku worked away at the dishes that kept on piling up. His sleeves were pulled up, showing off his forearms, and a couple buttons of his shirt were undone, showing his collarbone. Not fair. She wanted to walk over there so bad and just get to work. She heard Ryu's monotone voice as she was gripped by the back of her collar. "Ryu, no, come on, please just let me know." Not fair at all. Eventually, day turned to night and night turned to midnight as the hostess of fertility closed. Izuku had just finished up the last of the dishes that he had been given to clean and sighed in relief. He hadn't gotten a single break. He cleaned his hands with a rag that he found. Washing dishes for hours on end had been quite tiring. And that was a surprise given all the training he did with. All Might, he sighed. Would he ever be able to see his mentor again? Would he become the next symbol of peace like intended? Did he still have one for all? He sighed again. Questions for later. "Mr. Midoriya." He heard a monotone voice from behind him and turned, seeing a girl with green hair in the same outfit Anya and Chloe had been in. Unlike them, she didn't have cat ears, but her ears were pointed, almost like an elf. "You're staying in our guest room. Allow me to show you the way." "Ah, okay." He quickly grabbed his stuff and followed her up a flight of stairs. He was glad that Miss Mia was allowing him to stay, even if it was only because he was offering to do work in return. There was only one room and he assumed it was the guest room. The girl pushed the door open and allowed Izuku to enter. "This is the guest room. It's not much, but it's what we have. You'll stay here for the foreseeable future until you find out what you want to do." Izuku looked around the wooden room before turning to her and nodding. "Thank you." Ryu Lion." She answered impassively. "I have a couple questions about the dungeon. I don't want to take up too much of your time though, so if you want to leave since you have better things to do then I'm perfectly fine with." "It's fine, Mr. Midoriya. Ask away." She interrupted and she had to squint her eyes slightly when the boy smiled. What does someone have to do to be able to go into the dungeon? The dungeon of Aurario, which he found out was located underneath the tower that he had seen when he arrived in the city, scratched at something in him. He wanted to go, to see it for himself, but he didn't think he was ready for that yet. Whatever monsters dwelled inside, he wanted to make sure he could fight them before he ventured down. Ryu blinked before answering. "Well, first you must register with the guild at the guild hall, and of course receive a 𝗟𝗯." "A 𝗟𝗯." Ryu sighed. She'd have a lot of explaining to do. Bell was running with a blush down the street. He had woken up with Hestia on top of him. While of course it did seem like one of the many situations that his grandfather had told him about, Hestia was his goddess, he couldn't do that. So here he was running to the dungeon, slowly slowing down as he ran out of breath and energy. He had been sprinting ever since he left the rundown church. He panted as he came to a stop, putting his hands on his knees. Man didn't even get to eat. He gasped. "Hey, you dropped something." Belle turned to see a waitress, green dress, white apron, gray hair. "Here, it's yours," she said, smiling, as she handed him a magic crystal. Belle was a little confused. He had turned all of his crystals in already. "Take it." The girl winked at him, and Belle knew that she knew that the crystal wasn't his. But he reached and grabbed it anyway. "𝗬𝗲𝗄𝗧𝗏 𝗏𝐾𝐻." The girl leaned forward with a smile, producing a small wrapped item from behind her back and giving it to him. "Here, for lunch." I can't, I insist." She leaned forward a little bit more, frowning a bit as her eyes watered. "Or, do you not want it?" She was attacking him right in the heart and it was working perfectly. He resigned. "Fine, thank you." He blushed a bit as he took the offered food and stored it in his bag. "Is there anything I can do? To repay you, I mean." The girl leaned back on a foot, touching her chin with a finger before grinning. "I work at the hostess of fertility. Come by tonight for me, pretty please." Belle caved in and promised he would before heading for the dungeon once more. After all, he was an adventurer. The girl hummed to herself as she watched the boy slowly leave her line of sight. "Who was that, Miss Sir?" Izuku asked as he was sweeping at the front of the store. He quickly found out that all the boring jobs were going to be placed on him since all the waitresses didn't seem to like doing them. He didn't mind that much though. After all, they were showing him a lot of hospitality. Plus it gave him time to think about everything that Miss Ryu had told him yesterday. Sir turned to him and smiled. Just someone I'm interested in. 𝐒𝐿 blushed and looked away. Like, to date. Maybe. 𝐒𝐿 just continued his work as Sir went on inside. Eventually, as the pub opened, 𝐒𝐿 went inside as well. After all, he'd probably be on dish duty, so he'd have that to work on. Midoriya. He heard the gruff voice of 𝗵𝗲 and he turned to her. We're going to be having some special guests come in tonight. You can get a look at top-tier adventures that belong to the second-ranked familia in all of Arario, but try not to cause any problems. Familia, a group of members that had gained a 𝗲𝗄 from the same god. He'd learned all he could from Ryu last night and his brain was still trying to comprehend it all. 𝗲𝗄 were given to them by gods, allowing adventurers to earn 𝐒𝐴lia from the monsters in the dungeon, which raised stats that one gained when they had a 𝗲𝗄. And those that had a 𝗲𝗄 were in a familia, under the god that gave them said 𝗲𝗄. It was all so interesting and so different. Where he was from, the only thing that mattered was what you were born with. He was quirkless, so for the longest time he was useless, until he met All Might and the man gave him a quirk. But here, it was your hard work that you put when in the dungeon that mattered. I won't miss Mia, 𝐒𝐿 said. 𝗵𝗲, Miss just makes me feel old. She pushed him off to work. The day was most of the same. It passed by uneventfully as 𝐒𝐿 washed dishes, swept up any dirt that found its way into the pub, and cleaned tables as well. He hummed to himself as he worked, and he even got to see some adventurers and what they looked like. He had to wear his green vest. They didn't have a male uniform and 𝐒𝐿 was surely not going to wear a dress, so he put his vest on and 𝗵𝗲 said it was all right for him to wear. Sir seemed to be getting a little sad. 𝐒𝐿 had noticed. The person she was interested in hadn't shown up yet. Currently the two were sweeping together, but she wasn't putting that much effort into it. Maybe I can cheer her up, he mumbled to himself. He walked a little closer, making sure he was getting all the dust that covered the floor of the restaurant, before looking at her. Don't worry, mister. I'm sure he'll show up. She blushed and looked away. Am I that obvious? Kinda. Yeah, he admitted. She sighed. Well, thanks 𝐒𝐿, and you're right. He'll probably arrive soon enough. And the doors opened and in walked a white-haired teen that looked to be about 𝐒𝐿's age, if not then a year younger. Oh my god, he's here. My hair looks good, right? Oh, take my broom, please. Before 𝐒𝐿 could say anything, Sir was off, leading her new friend to a table and leaving Belle on sweeping duty. He sighed. Well, better get to our reserved guests are here. RK. 𝐒𝐿 trailed off as he looked at the doorway. It was held open as a large group of people sauntered their way in. At the head was a red-headed girl. He wasn't sure, but he assumed that he or she was the boss, and maybe the god or goddess of this familia, because they did not look like an adventurer. Midoriya, dishes duty, 𝗵𝗲 said, and he nodded, leaving both of the brooms off to the side as he got to cleaning dishes. He simply hummed some songs that he knew, because he was in no way a good singer. He had never even tried before. Well, that was a lie. He had a choir class once and that ended badly. He continued, absent-mindedly thinking about if he should try to use one for all again. He wasn't completely sure. Last time he had done that, he blew his legs to smithereens and was down an arm. Oh, and he ended up wherever he was. Maybe he'd hold off on testing one for all. Partway through his cleaning, Sir came into the kitchen with a distressed face. His humming took a pause. Did something happen, Mister? Belle left. Something happened, I don't know what. But he didn't pay and now 𝗵𝗲 is mad. She sighed with a pout. I wondered if I did something wrong. 𝐒𝐿 frowned a bit and looked at where the guy, Belle he now knew, had been. I'm sure it wasn't you, don't worry, he said, before drying his hands off and passing her a broom. What you should be worrying about is those floors. Don't want 𝗵𝗲 getting on your case, he said with a smile. She huffed a bit, chuckled, and smiled. Yeah, guess you're right. Sir left and sighed as she saw Chloe staring at the kitchen, a broom in her hand showing that she was on sweeping duty. Chloe, how are you holding it in? She asked. Ryu threatened me, she muttered. Sir winced and joined her co-worker in sweeping. 𝐒𝐿 thought about the dungeon, how badly he wanted to go into it, to be an adventurer, to reclaim his dream of being a hero. But he needed a 𝗲𝗄, and with the way he was now, well, Ryu said no one would want him in their familia. He was green as grass. They wanted people with promise, people that looked big and strong. The only thing 𝐒𝐿 had was his above-average muscles, which were outclassed by those of higher levels, rendering them useless, and his sword that just appeared when he woke up. But Ryu told him that it was just a normal sword, not a magic one, that it wasn't special. So, a miracle would have to happen if he wanted to join a familia. And then the doors slammed open. Hey, 𝗧𝗔, please quiet down. Not now, 𝗵𝗲. 𝐒𝐿 listened as the voice identified as 𝗧𝗔 walked to the counter and slammed her hands down. Where's Belle? I know he came here and it's almost midnight. Tell me where he is. 𝗧𝗍's eyes widened a bit. For one, he had no idea that it was almost midnight. And two, no one talked to 𝗵𝗲 like that. He'd only been here a day and he already knew that. He still remembered the ballsy newly reached level 2 adventurer that walked in like he owned the place. Thrown out like a sack of potatoes by Ryu, it made him wonder what her level was. But he figured that it might be something rude to ask, like a woman their age. The large dwarf lady sighed. "What do you want, 𝐡𝐵𝐵? You're causing a ruckus." Izuku heard her crack her knuckles. "Bell hasn't come home. He told me he'd be coming here and I haven't seen him since," she yelled. The redhead of the familia that came and got out of her chair and came over, leaning and putting her arm on the short 𝐡𝐵𝐵's head. Maybe he just realized he could find a better familia than whatever you could provide, short stack. Her voice reminded him of Kaken and it made Izuku frown. "That wasn't right. That was nowhere near right. You're wrong, Loki. Bell would never do that," 𝐡𝐵𝐵 protested. "Then where is he?" 𝐡𝐵𝐵 didn't have an answer. And that made Loki smile all the more. Izuku realized that all of these gods and goddesses were named after ones from the mythologies he knew about. But that's all, they were mythologies. They were stories. They weren't real. But then how did that explain these people's existence? 𝐡𝐵𝐵 curled in on herself as she heard more and more people laugh. She just wanted Bell back. She wanted to go to their church and sleep on their bed with Bell by her side. Loki just smiled as she sauntered back to her table. "Goddess 𝐡𝐵𝐵." Ryu's monotone voice drew attention as the goddess looked up at her. "I believe I saw Bell go in the direction of the dungeon." And she glared at the Loki familia and the goddess that had just returned to the table. "It seems that some of our other guests angered him, or rather embarrassed him," she told the goddess quietly. 𝐡𝐵𝐵's face reflected worry. "But he's already been in the dungeon today. He's tired. He can't go again. He's only level 1. Izuku clenched the plate he had in his hands. He wanted to help, to do something. But he wasn't even level 1. He didn't have stats. He didn't have levels. He didn't have a 𝐴𝐿𝐼. "I can't lose Bell. He's all I have." He felt the plate crack in his hands. Heroes meddle in things when they don't have to. Slam. "I'll go into the dungeon and get Bell back." Izuku couldn't just let someone plead for help. He had to do something, or else he wouldn't be all right with himself. 𝐡𝐵𝐵 stared at the greenette that was now in front of her, taking up a spot next to 𝗵𝗲 at her bar. The dwarf herself looked a little shocked, as well as many of the waitresses, though no one else seemed to care about what was going on, least of all the Loki familia. Ryu sighed. It was idiotic, trying to go into the dungeon without a 𝐴𝐿𝐼. No person had ever done so and survived. The monsters on floor 1 were hard to survive for new level 1s, and those without a 𝐴𝐿𝐼 could never progress in power. "Mr. Midoriya, you don't even have a 𝐴𝐿𝐼. How do you plan on Miss 𝐡𝐵𝐵? Please." The goddess saw his resolute face. "Give me a 𝐴𝐿𝐼. Let me save Bell." The goddess' eyes shone a bit and her eyes watered a bit as she nodded. 𝗵𝗲, can we borrow a room?" The dwarf sighed. "Fine, go do it upstairs. The moment you're out that door, I'm kicking you out. All right, Midoriya." She expected him to cower, to shiver, to do something. She was a member of the strongest familia in all of Arario, for God's sake. However, he just nodded. "I understand, and I thank you for everything you've done for me so far." Chloe frowned. She wanted Izuku to stay around longer. She wanted to see more about him, to maybe have a little bit of fun. "Am I still allowed to come here if I'm hungry though?" "Yeah, kid, now scram." The dwarf patted him on the back, ushering him upstairs, though he felt his back sting, like All Might had just punched him right in the middle of it. "So, what's your name?" 𝐡𝐵𝐵 asked him as they entered the guest room. Izuku pulling a stool towards him. "Izuku Midoriya, now let's hurry." He sat and took his shirt off, which was very embarrassing, as no girl had ever seen him like this. Ryu told him that a 𝐴𝐿𝐼 was located on someone's back, though he sucked in a breath and felt something impact his path, like a droplet of power. And then he felt power, not a lot, or maybe that was the wrong word. Baby pool was better. A wellspring of potential had just burst from within him and he smiled. 𝐡𝐵𝐵 smiled. Seeing the goblet of fire that represented her familia on this child's back, she had a second member. What she didn't notice was the skill that dwelled under all of his stats. "It's done. You now belong to the 𝐻𝐵𝐵𝐼 familia." Izuku nodded as he stood up, pulling his shirt back on along with his vest. "I want to thank you. After all, Bell's all I have. But why are you doing this?" Izuku turned to her and simply smiled. "A hero meddles even when they don't have to, even when they aren't asked. You needed help, so I offered it. Simple as that." His reasoning was so weird to her. This boy was so strange, and he sort of reminded her of Bell too. She could imagine Bell right in front of her and it made her heart clench. "But this is a big decision. You'll never be able to join another familia in your life." Izuku shrugged as he grabbed all of his bags and pouches. "I guess I'll never join another familia then." He smiled as he strapped his sword to his hip. "Now, I guess I'm off." He opened the door to the lone-in room and turned to 𝐡𝐵𝐵 and smiled. "I'll get Bell back, I promise." And just like that, he was gone. "Danger of the dungeon," Bell gasped as he stabbed a goblin in the side of his head with a dagger and it disappeared in a puff of black smoke. A small crystal falling to the ground, and he picked it up before straightening himself out as he greedily sucked in air. It was getting harder to keep up with the onslaught of kobolds and goblins that were coming at him. They were relatively weak monsters that occupied the first floor, wolves and small humanoid creatures, but they just kept on coming. He was getting tired. He didn't have as much experience as other adventurers. He didn't have as much stamina, but he was still going to get up and fight back. A goblin came out of nowhere and swiped at his arm, and he grunted before stepping back from it. It jumped at him and he ducked before stabbing its stomach. The goblin bursted into smoke like the one before it, and he grabbed the crystal, the only thing left of the creature besides blood that covered him, before taking a deep breath. Bell fell down a wall and sighed, just a bit more. He got back up with all the strength he could muster and walked further into the 4th floor. Ina said he couldn't venture past this floor, so he'd stay here as long as he could, fight as many monsters as he could, and win as much as he could. He wanted to prove himself to 𝐒𝐳𝐴𝐵. He wanted to be strong enough to stand by her side, and strong enough to make sure his goddess got out of the rundown church they stayed at. Not yet, just a bit more. He ran into an open area, multiple tunnels converging. He didn't care how tired he was, he'd keep on going. He heard the sound of walls opening, monsters coming out. He saw the red eyes of both kobolds and goblins come out of the tunnels as he readied his dagger. His hands were shaking, he was breathing rapidly, his vision was blurring. And no, he stabled his footing. This is my adventure, and it wasn't ending anytime soon. Izuku had just entered the dungeon. A kobold jumped at him and he tensed. He had never been in a fight before. He briefly flashed back to the entrance exam, his actions and how he had fought, or how he hadn't fought. He had just stood there as robots came out and tried to attack him. But here, right now, he could defend himself. He knew that. The robots were designed to be above him, for someone with a quirk to be able to fight them. Izuku had a quirk but no practice with it. But here, the dungeon, it was designed so new adventurers like him had a chance to fight and win. He drew his sword and knew what he had to do. He dodged a swipe from the dog-headed monster and retaliated with a sword strike. He missed his target, the chest, but he cut off an arm. He saw blood ooze from the severed limb and he gulped before steeling his nerves and blocked a claw strike from the monster and then striked back again, this time hitting his mark, and the monster dispersed in a black cloud of smoke. He smiled to himself as he grabbed the small crystals that landed on the ground and put them in his right hip pouch. His sword was actually pretty strong. Okay, down a floor, he doesn't seem to be here. He'd been told Bell had been an adventurer for 6 months. And while he didn't have that experience, he had instincts that were gifted to him by Kaken and his countless beating. He instantly knew where danger was and how to avoid it. Plus, thanks to Kaken again, his pain tolerance was very high. Miss Ryu said floor 5 and lower were for more experienced people, the lowest of that tier being groups of level 1s. So, Bell should be between here and floor 4 then. He mumbled to himself as a goblin jumped at him. He raised his sword and blocked, taking a moment to situate himself before striking back, stomach, chest, head, dead. He grabbed the crystal and put it in his bag before running off. He silently thanked All Might for making him do all of that cardio training. He'd never survive if he'd been without it. Hastja was situated at her church, clutching the one and only pillow they had as she stared at the ceiling. Bell-kun, her eyes teared up. She needed him to be okay, to be safe. She needed him back. She held the pillow tighter. It was her only lifeline for the moment. And then there was Izuku Midoriya, a boy who had come out of nowhere, offered her help, and gone to save Bell. He was strange. She knew nothing about him. He knew nothing about her, and yet he still went to get Bell back. Please, don't fail. Bring my Bell back. She'd pray to the gods still up there for divine intervention if she had to. She couldn't lose Bell. To say that Freya was intrigued was nothing short of an understatement. She arrived back at the top of her tower and fell into her chair that looked over the city. Izuku Midoriya. He was as pure as Bell, if not purer. He was interesting, and she wanted him. Hell, she had basically already claimed the boy, but that half-stack goddess took him too. She wanted to scream, to yell, to do something. She wanted what was hers. Otter. The bows tensed as his goddess called on him. Look over Izuku for me. He wants to be a hero. Help him grow, help him get stronger. Yes, goddess. His monotone voice called out. She poured some wine and swirled it in her cup before taking a sip. She watched over both of the children. She knew the danger they were in. One, pushing himself to his limits in the deadly dungeon, something that had pushed many other adventurers to death. The other, going down to the 3rd floor despite being as green as grass in terms of adventuring. He knew nothing about this world. He probably didn't know the dangers either. Otter, go make sure they return to the surface safely. Yes, goddess. The large man left and she curled into her large chair. She had certain urges to attend to. Oh, see crap. He dodged under a swipe from a goblin while taking its arm off in the process. He was currently on the 3rd floor and had found no sight of Bell so far. Jumping back from the goblin, he grabbed the sword's handle with both hands as he and the monster circled each other. Row, the thing yelled before jumping at him. He sidestepped and took its other arm before stabbing its head. The creature, like the rest so far, had dispersed in black smoke, and he added the crystal it dropped into his bag. He sighed a bit. This was getting tiring. Just one more floor. Hastja needed Bell. He was all she had. He would get Bell out of this alive even if it cost him his own. because that's what a hero did. And I will be a hero. With renewed vigor, he ran down the halls of the dungeon's third floor, quickly taking out both kobolds and goblins with his sword, striking at their heads and chest. He was getting used to it. It was becoming easier, but he was getting tired. I need to finish this, fast. He ran and found the entrance of the fourth floor and smiled. All right. He smiled as he gasped for air before walking down. He immediately flinched as he heard yelling. It was slightly high-pitched and it was sort of familiar. That's Bell, he yelled before sprinting towards the direction of the yelling. Bell yelled as a kobold bit into his arm in his bicep area, the arm that had his dagger in it. He dropped the dagger before catching it with his other hand and stabbing the kobold in the brain. No sooner did it explode into black dust. He winced as he felt the blood ooze out of his arm, but he couldn't dwell on it as he was still surrounded. 6 kobolds and 7 goblins. He gulped. Up until now he was barely able to fight 2 monsters at once, and now he was dealing with 13. He was simply outnumbered. And then he saw one poof into dust in the corner of his eye. Keep on fighting. A random voice yelled. All right. Bell didn't know who this stranger was, but his words reinvigorated him, pushed him to keep on going despite his exhaustion. He dodged a swipe from a kobold and kicked it away, knocking it away and into a group of other monsters before stabbing it in the back of the head. He retracted his knife as it turned to black smoke. Izuku yelled as he swung his sword in a wide arc, taking 2 heads off of 2 monsters at once. He didn't know why, but this sword filled him with strength, vigor, power. He made his way to the center and stood back to back with Bell. His hands were tingling. The sword was calling to him. He didn't know why, but he felt it, something drawing him into the blade. A calling, snapping from his thoughts. He blocked a strike from a monster and sliced in a horizontal arc, making its chest bleed. He jumped back as another monster got in his way and took its arm off with his sword. Just 10 more. He was losing breath. A lot. Bell wasn't doing that well either. He had yet to take out another monster and his injured arm was holding him down. Izuku's grip on his sword tightened as he slashed the head off of the goblin that was down an arm. Just 9 more, Bell. He yelled with a strain. It was like doing reps for an exercise. Just a couple more. Yeah, it would burn. Yeah, it hurt. But it was just a couple more, so what did it matter? Okay. Bell grunted as he kicked a kobold before stabbing his dagger into its head. It disappeared in black smoke, making him sigh. 8. He called out as he jumped back from 2 monsters. Both boys were running on low as they stood back to back. Izuku felt his sword still wanting him to do something, but he didn't know what to do. Okay, just 8 more. He readied himself. Bell tumbled back and collided with Izuku. Sorry, just everything's getting dark. Izuku cursed as the boy fell onto his knees, panting for breath. The greenette stood over Bell as he swiped at a goblin. He grabbed the boy and put him over his shoulder. After all he had been able to carry All Might around at the beginning of his training, Bell wasn't too bad. He ran to one of the far walls, striking his sword out at any monsters to get them to back off, before setting Bell down on the wall. It would be easier to defend him that way than in the middle of a circle. The 8 monsters stood in front of Izuku. 4 of each monster were still standing against them. Izuku knew he couldn't fight them on his own. If only he had enough power to do this. One for all. Izuku muttered absent-mindedly. If only he had that power to save the person in front of him right now. However, when he uttered those words, his sword burned, almost as if responding to what he had said. Izuku looked at his blade with a quizzical brow before he faced it against the monsters. The silver blade began to glow, almost calling him to use it, to fight with its strength, as a brilliant golden power with sparks of green dancing across Izuku's arms. He smiled as he felt the familiar power encompass him. One for all. He smiled as he knew that the familiar power was All Might's. He noticed that the weight of the blade increased as it dipped. He flexed his forearms to keep the sword from falling into the ground. All right. Straining his muscles, he brought the blade onto his shoulder with some effort and his grin widened. Golden flames, ones of pure power, burned off of Izuku. A figure formed, one that resembled Japan's #1 hero, All Might. 100%. He brought the blade out and retracted it behind him before throwing it forward. The manifestation of the power copying his actions slash. A wave of energy came off of him, an arc of golden flames shooting out and evaporating all of the monsters into dust before they dropped their crystals. Izuku was relieved when pain didn't invade his limbs, though he did feel extreme exhaustion in all of them, which made stumble forward as he seemingly lost all of his energy. And no, not, yeah. The boy clattered onto the ground, his sword by his side. Hard and rough footsteps were heard as a giant man came into the small opening. They actually managed to take out all the monsters. His emotionless voice gave way to none of his thoughts as he walked over and picked up both boys, slinging them over his shoulders and walking to the exit of the dungeon. Interesting indeed. The next thing Izuku knew, he was waking up on an unfamiliar couch in an unfamiliar room. He winced as light invaded the area through some curtains, and it took him a noticeable amount of effort to sit up. He could feel how sore all of his body was, though it wasn't as bad as the time he carried All Might. Looking around, he saw his bag on a far wall, his sword there as well as his vest and shirt, which hung off the blade. Glancing at his stomach, he noticed bandages across him. Guess it was worse than I thought. Moving, he set his feet on the ground and stood up off the couch. He wobbled for a second, but he caught himself quickly. Izuku heard the sound of a door creaking and looked to the only door he had seen in the room. Peering in was a pink-haired girl that looked to be in some sort of business suit. He's awake. The next moment, Izuku saw a brunette with green eyes was in the room wearing the same clothes as the pink-haired girl, seemingly prepared to yell his ear off. I don't have a shirt on. He hid behind the couch. Realization came to the girl's eyes. Rose, you said he was awake. He's still asleep. The pinkette peeked back into the room. Oh, well, what about him? She pointed at Izuku. The boy was still behind the couch. The brunette tilted her head. She had never seen this boy before, and she had a knack for remembering faces, if you don't mind me asking. She pushed up her glasses, trying to remember this person, but to no avail. Who are you? The boy blushed before going to his bag and putting on his white shirt. He distinctly remembered his clothes being torn. Not to shreds, but at least ruined a little. They must have fixed them. He turned to stare at the two women in suits. He awkwardly waved. Hi, I'm Izuku Midoriya. Part of the 𝐒𝐫𝐵. Was he supposed to say that? Well, he felt like he wasn't because one of the attendants' eyes widened. But Belle's the only member of the 𝐒𝐫𝐵. She pointed at him, her brows scrunched. She looked mad. Izuku raised his hands in surrender. I just joined yesterday, last night. I swear. He sweated as the attendant narrowed her eyes at him. Why, you can check my 𝐿𝐵. It'll be the same as Belle's, I promise. The lady sighed before nodding. All right, we'll get to that once Belle wakes up. But for now, you're coming with you. You aren't even registered with the guild and yet you still went into the dungeon. She sighed. This is going to take a while. Izuku scrambled to follow, putting his vest on and grabbing his bags before following her. So, what's your name? Izuku asked quietly, trying to make at least a little conversation. He had terrible social skills before the entrance exam, so he was surprised that he was doing so well now. Perhaps well wasn't the best way to put it, but he was doing better, if only slightly. Ina Toll. She responded curtly, professionally. Izuku nodded. It's nice to meet you, Miss Ina. He smiled as she opened a door for him to walk through. He went in and she followed, closing the door behind her. So, what are we doing here? He asked as he glanced at the grand wooden halls. The woman sighed. Well, you're not registered with the guild. You went into the dungeon despite that, and so we're going to register you and deal with a lot of paperwork. She gestured to a pair of couches across from each other. Take a seat, Mr. Midoriya. This will take a while. Izuku did as told and she pulled out a stack of papers. One easily triple, no, quadruple the size of the American Dream Plan. He sweat dropped. That's a lot. I know, Ina commented before pulling the first one. Name, familia, all that basic stuff here. Izuku read over the paper, writing down his name and familia like she said. But there was also stuff like age that he had to write down. Eventually, he finished the first page with a smile on his face. Izuku Midoriya, age 15, 𝐻𝐵 familia level 1, skills, and spells, and it was just some of the information he had to write down and a couple paragraphs that he had to read and sign. He handed it back to her. Done, Miss Ina. He smiled as he spoke quietly. The woman pushed up her glasses as she took the paper and read over it before nodding to herself. All right, 1 out of 235. We're going to be here a while. Izuku sighed as the final paper was finished. So much information had been drilled into his head. He thought that he had learned more than ever before when talking to Miss Ryu about Aurelio, but he was sorely mistaken. His brain was smoking as he let all of the information sit in. He had to rest his head, take a nap, something to help him relax. This is a lot. Sighing, he sank into the couch as he fell backwards into the couch. Ina smiled as she gathered all of the papers together. Yes, that's how it usually is. Though most of the guild advisors aren't as hands-on with their adventurers as I am. She clapped the papers against the table in front of her and straightened them out before standing up. I need to go have these processed. She left and Izuku sat as he waited for her to come back. He thought back to his sword. The blade was so interesting. It called to him, and Izuku knew that the blade was special. To him, one for all. The blade had it, contained it, or was it? He wasn't entirely sure. What he did know was that one way or another, the sword was the only thing he had that remained of his past life, that and his shoes. He smiled slightly to himself as he sat up. I didn't break my arms either, but I passed out. Was that because I was already tired, or did one for all make me pass out? What are you going on about? Izuku jolted as he looked up. He hadn't heard the door open, yet Ina was standing there. Are you all right? Izuku got up and nodded. Why yes, just thinking is all. I think out loud a lot. He got quieter as he spoke. Ina tilted her head. So far Izuku Midoriya had been a bit strange, but he wasn't unwelcomed. He was polite and quiet, mostly keeping to himself. It was strange. Most adventurers were either one of the two or neither. Belle was very polite but always excited about something, but not this boy. She pushed up her glasses and erased the thought. If you'll come with me, you can now turn in your magic stones. She opened the door for Izuku to follow. The boy did so as he opened up his hip pouch and grabbed all the small crystals he had picked up. I didn't get the ones after I passed out, he muttered to himself as he sighed. With Ryu's teaching and Ina's mind bashing, he understood what the crystals were for. It was how adventurers made their money. They got a sum equal to what they turned in. The larger the crystal and the more they had meant they got more money in return. And I didn't get all I could. Izuku sighed as he was issued behind a wooden flap door. He assumed that the area he was in was the main lobby of the Adventurers Guild. It was spacious, and not too many people were around, so he thought it was still early in the morning. Over here, Mr. Midoriya. Ina led him to a desk where she passed him off to another receptionist to turn in his crystals. He laid them all and received a hefty amount in return. 39 ovalis. He smiled a bit to himself. This was more money than he had ever had before, so of course he was a little happy. He was aware it wasn't that much, but still, he earned it. If you'll come back to the room and wait for Belle to wake up, I'll see if I can get Goddess Hestia here. Izuku nodded and walked back since he remembered the way they took. Ina watched as he left. Still, he hadn't said a word. He only spoke when necessary or when it was too quiet. He mumbled to himself too. He's strange. Izuku sighed as he entered the room he woke up in and sat on the couch he had been laying on. He looked at Belle. The boy looked peaceful and Izuku smiled. At least Belle's all right. He drew his sword and looked over it. The silver blade looked completely fine and had no imperfections in it, which was surprising because he cut down a lot of monsters with it the previous day, though it was a little dirty. Opening up his bag, he found a rag and smiled to himself as he cleaned his blade, getting rid of any dirt that was on the blade, or even any blood that was on it too. He thought he'd be more affected, but he really wasn't. The monsters of the dungeon respond. That's how they were such good income for adventurers, how people made a career out of going into the dungeon. But they hurt people. At heart, they were evil. Villains. And while Izuku wasn't alright with killing villains, the monsters didn't seem to possess any intelligence. They were just very strong animals that sought to kill people. Monster really does fit, he said aloud as he finished the boy. Smiling, he lifted the sword and smiled at his reflection. One for all. The sword seemed to glow a bit when he said that. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad after all. Izuku perked up when he heard the creaking of the door to the room, not having heard anything but silence while he sat and cleaned his sword. Peeking inside was a small woman that he instantly recognized. Miss Hestia. The raven-haired woman gazed at the couches, her eyes landing on the white hair of her first ever child. 𝐵𝐵𝐿𝐿. The goddess cried as she basically strangled the boy. Izuku just watched on and let a small smile grace his face. The goddess turned to him with tears in her eyes. Thank you. The boy simply shook his head. There was no need. He didn't need any sort of thanks. He was just doing what a hero would have done, just something out of the goodness of his heart. They eventually woke Belle up, and Izuku just stood by. He would have to introduce himself at some point, but Belle was clearly too out of it. He was swaying and was only on his feet because Hestia was holding him up. All right, that should be all, Miss Ina said, smiling as the last of the paperwork was finally done. They were allowed to go home now. She clapped it on her desk and stood up. Now please have Belle rest at least a little bit before he ventures into the dungeon again. Would you two please not talk as if I'm not right here? The boy groaned a bit, groggily. Izuku smiled, watching off from the side as he hefted his sword onto his back. Ina huffed. You don't get a say in things anymore, Belle. Yeah, Belle. Hestia huffed, said. Boy let out a sigh, still too tired to even process anything. The sleep had helped, quite a bit actually, but now he was just drained. Now, Izuku, usually we would charge you for all the mana potions you used, but as this is a very special situation, we've decided not to, Miss Ina stated. Izuku and Hestia both raised a brow. Izuku because he didn't entirely know what mana potions were and what they involved, and Hestia because she knew Izuku didn't have any spells. Ina, Izuku doesn't have any spells. Why would he need those potions? The guild manager pushed her glasses up. Well, when he arrived he had a large case of mine down. He was completely out of mana. She tilted her head and glanced at Izuku. You don't have any spells. Izuku shook his head. He didn't even know what a spell was. Ina knitted her brows. This truly was intriguing. Well, that's a matter for another day. For now, try to get settled into your new familia, Izuku, and Belle, you can go home and rest. The two boys did just that. Izuku was surprised to say the least at their conditions of living. After all, shouldn't a goddess be living somewhere a little more better maintained than a run-down church? Izuku entered the bottom room where they actually had their living quarters, carrying Belle over his shoulder and depositing him onto the bed that they had. He was knocked out soon after they left the guild hall, and Izuku began to carry him like a sack of potatoes. It was a rather large bed. Other than that, they had a couch and a small table. Off to the side they had a bathroom. It was honestly depressing. 𝐒𝐭𝐚𝐲 felt bad if he was being honest. He looked to the doorway to see Goddess 𝗧𝗵𝗲 enter. She sheepishly rubbed the back of her head. It's not much, I know. Bell's my first ever child and he's only level 1, so we don't have much. 𝐒𝐭𝐴 shook his head. No, it's all right. He glanced back at the barren room, a goal forming in his mind. He would continue to be a hero, the best hero 𝐒𝐴rario had ever seen. But he also swore that he would help the 𝗧𝗵𝗲 become an amazing one, so they wouldn't have to suffer like this anymore. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 walked over and sat on the couch, patting next to her. Come on, let's get your status updated. 𝗧𝗏𝗂 happily obliged, taking his shirt off for her to see. Holy crap. Her scream pierced 𝗧𝗏𝗂's ears, yet somehow had not managed to wake up Bell. 𝗧𝗏𝗂 robotically turned around and messaged his ears. What was that for? He silently yelled back. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 stammered for a second before sighing. You have a quick leveling skill, just like. She sighed again, sounding 10 times more tired. Don't tell him, but Bell has one too. Your skill is different though. It's called 𝗬𝗵𝗲 and it says as long as you stay true to your dream then this skill shall remain. 𝗧𝗏𝗂 pondered the words for a second before his face broke out into a smile. I promise you, Goddess, my dream's never going to die. He was going to be a hero, even if it wasn't the way he originally thought. Going into the dungeon, saving Bell, that's what a hero would have done, and 𝗧𝗏𝗂 did that. It made him happy. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 tilted her head a bit. She knew at that moment, this child was going to be crazy. The next day, 𝗧𝗏𝗂 stood in the ruins of the church, swinging his sword over and over, sweat dripping from his body. He had been at it for hours at this point, and yet he still continued. He needed to be stronger if he wanted to be a hero. I'm only level 1. He slashed the air in front of him, his eyes for once serious instead of soft. There are people that are level 6. Another. This time he turned around and cut, sweat falling off of him. I must reach higher. The sword glowed for a second. 𝗧𝗏𝗂 paused to look at it before it quietly faded away. He furrowed his brow, one for all. He would figure out how to tap into his idol's power, even if he blew off his arms. Yeah, Bell, come on. He heard from the door that led to their living arrangements. Out came 𝗧𝗵𝗲 with a revitalized-looking Bell. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 smiled as she gestured to 𝗧𝗏𝗂. He's the guy that saved you from the dungeon. 𝗧𝗏𝗂 smiled. Finally, he got to properly meet Bell. He dropped his sword and walked over, raising a hand. It's nice to meet you. I'm 𝗧𝗏𝗂. 𝗧𝗏𝗄 Midori. Bell looked the boy up and down before grabbing his hand with his own. Bell Cránel, nice to meet you, 𝗧𝗏𝗂. He smiled. Thank you for saving me, and for joining our familia. Goddess told me all about you. Seriously, I thank you from the bottom of my heart. 𝗧𝗏𝗂 waved a hand. I'm happy that I was able to help, and I'm more than happy to be a part of this familia. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 smiled and patted both of her children on the back. Now, boys, enough talking. Both of you should head to the guild and talk to Aina if you really want to see about tackling the lower floors. She glanced at the clothes both of them were wearing, and hopefully she can help you with your clothes. The two glanced at each other, raising their brows. What's wrong with our clothes? They spoke in sync. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 blanched as she glanced between the two of them. Well, they're a little not that protective. They both looked at each other once more before smiling and rubbing the back of their necks. Looks like they needed to see about getting some new clothes. Also, I'll be gone for the next 2 or 3 days. Wait, what? The two boys left the church ruins, heading to where the guild hall was, before Bell stopped. Wait, before we go to the guild, can we go to the hostess of fertility? He asked, checking his pockets for his bag of volleys. 𝗧𝗏𝗂 tilted his head before realizing why Bell wanted to go. You forgot to pay for your meal. I know. 𝗧𝗏𝗂 sighed and patted the boy on the back. All right, let's head to the hostess of fertility. The duo made their way over, talking with each other and getting to actually know one another as they were still complete and total strangers. The only thing they had in common was that they were in the same familia. Well, as far as they knew at least. But they'd be traveling into the dungeon together, so they'd need to learn more about each other if they really wanted to be able to work together well. And after I arrived, no one would take me in. Until one day I found Goddess 𝗧𝗵𝗲. Bell rubbed the back of his head and smiled. She was the only one that would take me in. No one else would give me the time of day. He still remembered that day. Her telling him about her familia, how he would be the only member in that dark and dirty alley. He still dreamed about that day. 𝗧𝗏𝗂 smiled at his familia member. They weren't quite friends, but he hoped they could become friends. So, what did you do when you got to 𝗂𝗏ario, 𝗧𝗏𝗂? Bell asked as they turned within sight distance of the hostess of fertility. Now it was 𝗧𝗏𝗂's turn to rub the back of his head. I just stayed at the hostess. They took me in and let me work in exchange for staying there. They finally arrived and 𝗧𝗏𝗂 opened the door to let Bell go in first. You little 𝗵𝗲 came storming out from behind the counter the moment her eyes landed on Bell. This would take a while. Again, I am so sorry, Bell yelled, bent at a 90 degrees with a bag of volleys held in front of him. This is everything I owe for the meal from yesterday. And even a little more. 𝗧𝗏𝗂 had seen Bell get the bag ready, and he suggested putting in a little extra as an apology for running. 𝗵𝗲 grabbed the sack of volleys and smiled at the weight of it. I appreciate you coming back and giving this to me. Her grin turned dark. If not, I'd have to have found your ass and taken the money myself. 𝐒𝐭𝐚𝐲 sorry. 𝗧𝗍𝗂 chuckled as he stood off to the side, enjoying the atmosphere of the hostess. Are you gonna come back every once in a while to eat, Naya? Anya asked as she not so stealthily walked up to 𝗧𝗍𝗂. The greenette smiled at her and nodded. I plan on it. Well, once I have good money. The girl's smile was worth it. It filled 𝗧𝗍𝗂 with warmth. He had made someone happy. Heroes saved and protected other people, but also their smiles, their happiness. After all, what was the point of being around if you weren't happy? Shaking his head and getting out of his train of thought, 𝗧𝗍𝗂 turned back. Seeing Belle's head almost touch the floor from how deep he was bowing, it made him chuckle. We best be off, 𝗔𝗍𝗵𝗲. We're going to head to the guild hall and see about getting better equipment. The giant lady smiled as the two walked out. All right. Good luck, freshie. 𝗧𝗍𝗂 blanched as they entered the street. She would have murdered you. Belle seemed shaken, not even hearing 𝗧𝗍𝗂 say anything and simply continuing toward the guild hall. Today's gonna be a long day. They made their way to the guild hall, but they were both out of their depth as they stood outside, waiting for other to go in first. They looked at each other before sighing and walking in together. An elf woman of moderate height with short hair and glasses perked up as she spotted both of the children of 𝗧𝗏. Belle and 𝗧𝗍𝗂, what are you two doing here? The receptionist asked as the two approached her. 𝗧𝗍𝗂 and Belle grinned as they both spoke in unison. We were wondering if you could help us get better equipment. The half-elf sighed and smiled slightly. How about at the end of the week? Right now I'm not sure you two have enough volleys to purchase some stuff on the lower floors of the tower. Maybe for one but not both of you. So take the week to get as much volleys as you can and then we can go out and see about getting you two equipment. All right. The two rabbit-like boys shared a glance and thought over the situation. True, they did truly not have enough volleys for the both of them. All right, that works, Miss Ina. Belle smiled. It turned back to her as 𝗧𝗍𝗂 hummed along. All right, well, I'm glad. She looked at them before humming. If you two want, you can go down to the 5th floor. But since 𝗧𝗍𝗂 is a green rookie, then make sure he can at least handle the first couple of floors. All right. Yes, I will, Miss Ina. We will, miss. The two made their way out, excited to once again hit the dungeon. 𝗧𝗍𝗂 had found himself fascinated by the structure that had stood for so long, the one that the gods themselves sent their children down into to explore, and he wanted to explore all of it, to help whoever found themselves in trouble inside the depths of the dungeon. So, as the two found themselves walking down the steps to head down to the 1st floor, 𝗧𝗍𝗂 found himself doing something strange to any other person they would cross. He was smiling,